I came home from a 6-day work trip and found part of my neighbor's house hanging over my backyard. Not near my property line. Not close to it. Actually over it. And somehow, the craziest part wasn't the structure itself. It was the look on my neighbor's face when I asked him about it. Like I was the one being unreasonable. Even now, when I think back on that afternoon, I can still remember standing there with my suitcase sitting in the grass, staring up at a brand new balcony that hadn't existed when I left, wondering how in the world someone could convince themselves this was acceptable. To understand why it hit me so hard, you need to understand what that backyard meant to me. Back in 2019, I bought a modest 2-story house outside Lexington, Kentucky. Nothing special from the street. Older brick exterior, creaky front porch, a roof that always seemed one storm away from giving me a reason to call an insurance company. But the backyard was different. The lot stretched far deeper than most in the neighborhood, and right in the middle stood a massive oak tree that had probably been there longer than any house on the block. During summer afternoons, its branches spread so wide they cast shade across almost the entire yard. The first time I saw the property, my realtor kept talking about square footage and resale value, but I barely heard her. I was looking at that yard. After spending years traveling for work and living out of hotels, I wanted one thing more than anything else. Peace. A place that felt like mine. For several years, that's exactly what I had. The house behind mine belonged to an elderly couple named Frank and Martha. They spent their days gardening and waving politely from a distance. We weren't close friends, but we respected each other. Then they moved to Florida. Their house sat empty for a few months before being sold to a younger couple named Ethan and Brooke Walker. At first, they seemed perfectly pleasant. Ethan was the type of guy who always sounded like he was pitching a business opportunity. Fast talker, big smile, endless confidence. Brooke was quieter, polished, the kind of person who somehow looked prepared for a magazine photo shoot every time she stepped outside. The first real conversation I had with Ethan happened over the fence one Saturday morning while I was trimming branches from the oak tree. He leaned over and grinned. "Just wanted to give you a heads up," he said. "We're probably tearing this place down." I laughed because I thought he meant renovating. "You mean remodeling?" He shook his head. "Nope. Full rebuild. Dream house." The way he said dream house sounded less like a plan and more like a mission statement. I wished him luck and went back to trimming branches. Honestly, I wasn't thrilled about living behind a construction site, but people rebuild homes all the time. Neighborhoods change. That's life. A couple months later, the old house disappeared. Completely gone. Then came the trucks. The dumpsters. The nail guns firing before breakfast. Every morning felt like someone was hosting a lumberjack convention directly behind my fence. Still, I kept my mouth shut. Construction ends eventually. At least that's what I told myself. As the new house started taking shape, I noticed something that bothered me. The back wall facing my yard was almost entirely glass. Massive windows stretched across both floors. One evening, my friend Greg from down the street stopped by while we watched workers finish the framing. He squinted toward the house and said, "Man, they really want to see everything in your backyard." I laughed it off, but deep down I knew what he meant. Privacy is one of those things you never think about until someone takes it away. Still, windows are windows. You close the blinds and move on. By late summer, the house looked nearly finished. White exterior, black accents, the kind of modern farmhouse design that seems to appear on every home renovation show these days. On the second floor, there were large sliding doors overlooking my property. At the time, they opened to nothing. No deck, no balcony, no platform, just doors. Then in October, I left town for a routine work assignment in Tennessee. Nothing unusual. I locked the house, asked Greg to keep an eye on things, and expected life to look pretty much the same when I returned. It didn't. The moment I stepped through my backyard gate 6 days later, something felt off. At first I couldn't figure out what it was. Then I noticed a shadow stretching across the grass where sunlight normally fell. I looked up. My stomach dropped. A brand new second-story balcony now extended from the back of Ethan's house. And it wasn't simply close to the property line. It crossed it. The structure projected several feet into the airspace above my yard, and one of the support posts appeared to be planted directly inside my property. I dropped my suitcase and walked closer. Half the branches from my oak tree had been cut away. Fresh cuts. Clean cuts. Not storm damage. Not trimming. Removal. I stood there staring upward while a slow anger settled into my chest. Not explosive anger. The dangerous kind. The quiet kind that grows colder the longer you think about it. Then I heard a sliding door open above me. Ethan stepped out onto the balcony, leaned casually against the railing, smiled down at me, and said something that instantly made me realize this situation was going to become much bigger than a construction mistake. He leaned against that railing like a man showing off a new grill to a neighbor. Completely relaxed. Completely comfortable. Standing on a structure that was literally hanging over my backyard. "Hey," he called down. "You're back." I looked from the support post to the cut branches, then back to him. "Yeah," I said slowly. "I just got back." He smiled and tapped the railing with his hand. "What do you think?" For a second I honestly thought maybe he was joking. Maybe this was some bizarre misunderstanding that would be cleared up in 30 seconds. "What do I think about what?" I asked. His grin widened. "The balcony." I stared at him. "Why is your balcony over my yard?" His expression paused for just a fraction of a second before he shrugged. "It's just airspace." I remember blinking because my brain genuinely needed a moment to process what I had just heard. "What?" He laughed lightly. "It's not like we're using your lawn." I pointed toward the support post. "That post is literally in my property." He glanced down. "The contractor handled all that." If you've ever dealt with construction disputes, you know those 5 words almost always mean somebody made a very expensive mistake. I pointed toward the oak tree. "And half my tree is gone." He followed my finger and nodded casually. "Yeah, they had to clear room for the deck line." The deck line. Like it was some force of nature. Like gravity or weather. I took a slow breath. "Did anyone think to ask me?" Another shrug. "I figured you'd be okay with it." That was the exact moment I realized the problem wasn't the balcony. The problem was that Ethan genuinely believed he had already won. He thought the structure was finished, the money was spent, and therefore I'd eventually accept it. I didn't argue. I simply nodded and said, "I'm going to check my survey." He smiled like the conversation had gone well. "Sounds good." Then he walked back inside. An hour later, I was standing in my backyard with the original survey documents from my home purchase spread across a patio table. I measured everything twice, then 3 times. The numbers didn't change. The balcony projected nearly 3 feet beyond the property line. The support post sat over 2 feet inside my lot. I photographed everything. Every angle. Every measurement. Every cut branch. By sunset, Greg was standing beside me staring upward. "No way," he said. "Yep. They built that while you were gone." "Apparently." He shook his head slowly. "That takes confidence." Confidence was one word for it. The next morning I called the city building department. The woman who answered introduced herself as Diane. Her voice had the calm patience of somebody who spent her career listening to neighbors argue about fences, sheds, and property lines. I explained the situation. She asked for photographs. 10 minutes after I emailed them, my phone rang. "Sir," she said carefully, "that appears to be a structural encroachment." It was the first time I'd heard the term, but it sounded serious. She asked if I had a survey. I sent that too. 20 minutes later she called back and said something that immediately got my attention. "We're sending an inspector." 3 days later a city truck pulled up behind the Walker house. The inspector's name was Randall. Mid-50s, practical, the kind of guy who looked like he'd spent decades solving problems caused by people who thought rules only applied to other people. We walked the property together. He measured the post, measured the overhang, compared everything to the survey. Then he looked up at the balcony and asked, "Do you know if they got a permit for this?" "No idea," I said. He nodded. "We're about to find out." Then he walked next door. From my yard I watched Ethan answer the door. At first he looked completely relaxed. Then he noticed the city logo on Randall's truck. I actually watched the smile disappear from his face. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see Randall pointing toward the post, then toward my yard, then toward the balcony itself. Ethan kept gesturing with his hands like he was explaining why none of this should matter. Randall didn't seem impressed. Eventually, he pulled a bright orange notice from his clipboard and taped it directly to the sliding door leading onto the balcony. Even from my yard, I could read the words. "Stop work order. Violation notice." Ethan stared at it like somebody had just informed him Christmas was canceled. That afternoon, there was a knock at my front door. Ethan stood outside. No smile. No confidence. No sales pitch energy. Just frustration. "You called the city?" he asked. "Yep." He shook his head. You could have talked to me first. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. I did talk to you. Remember the part where I asked why your balcony was over my yard? His jaw tightened. Before he could answer, Brooke appeared behind him. She stepped forward and immediately took control of the conversation. Look, she said, we're neighbors. Nobody wants this to become a huge issue. Then move the balcony, I replied. Her polite smile barely moved. That would require redesigning part of the house. There it was. The truth. The structure existed because it was easier and cheaper than following the property line. Ethan jumped back in. It's just a couple feet. It's my couple feet. He rubbed his forehead. Do you have any idea what this is going to cost? I looked past him toward the orange violation notice still hanging on the balcony door. Probably less than it would have cost to build it correctly the first time. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Brooke tried a different strategy. She offered to pay for landscaping, to maintain the tree, to improve the fence. Every proposal carefully avoided the actual issue. Finally, I said, the problem isn't the tree. The problem isn't the fence. The problem is that part of your house is sitting on my property. Her smile vanished. The conversation ended shortly after that. Over the next few weeks, things became awkward. We stopped acknowledging each other. The balcony sat unused. Workers occasionally appeared to take measurements before leaving again. Every time I stepped into my backyard, I could feel that structure hanging above me like a challenge. Then, 3 weeks later, Diane called. The review is complete, she said. I sat down at my kitchen table, and papers shuffled on her end of the line. The balcony was not properly permitted as constructed. The support posts are approximately 28 inches inside your property boundary. The homeowners have been issued a structural encroachment violation and have 30 days to correct it. I already knew the answer, but I asked anyway. Correct it how? Another pause. Either remove the structure or rebuild it entirely within legal setbacks. When the call ended, I walked outside and looked up at the balcony again. The late afternoon sun cast its familiar shadow across my lawn. But for the first time since discovering it, I felt calm. Because the decision wasn't mine anymore. The city had made it. The strange part wasn't the ruling. The strange part was the waiting. Those 30 days felt like a silent standoff. Ethan barely looked at me anymore. Sometimes I'd see him standing in his backyard staring at the balcony with the same expression people wear when they realize a mistake is about to become extremely expensive. One evening, he stopped at the fence while I was raking leaves. You're really going to make us tear it down? He asked quietly. I leaned on the rake and looked at him for a long moment. Then I said something that ended the conversation immediately. No, Ethan. I'm not the one who built it. For a second, it looked like he wanted to argue. Like he wanted to explain why the rules should somehow bend around his situation. But nothing came out. He just stared at the ground, nodded once, and walked back toward his house. After that, we stopped speaking completely. The orange violation notice stayed taped to the balcony door like a giant reminder that confidence and legality are not the same thing. Then day 32 arrived. Early Monday morning, I woke up to the sound of diesel engines outside. The same kind of construction trucks that had spent months building the place were back again. Only this time, they weren't delivering materials. They were there to take them away. I poured a cup of coffee and walked onto my deck just as the crew started removing the railing. Metal brackets popped loose one after another. Deck boards came up in long sections. Every crack and scrape echoed across the yard. Ethan stood in the grass with his hands on his hips, watching silently. Nobody looked happy. Nobody looked victorious. It was just the sound of consequences arriving on schedule. By the second day, the workers were dismantling the support beams. Huge timbers that had extended over my property were lowered to the ground piece by piece. The balcony seemed to shrink with every hour that passed, retreating back toward the house where it should have been from the beginning. On the third day, they tackled the support posts. Those were buried in concrete, and removing them required jackhammers, shovels, and a surprising amount of effort. I stood beneath the oak tree while the crew broke apart the foundation around the final post. When it finally came free and was lifted out of the ground, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Relief. The foreman walked over afterward, wiping dust from his hands. Sorry you had to deal with all this, he said. I nodded. Appreciate you fixing it. He gave a tired little laugh. Trust me, none of us would have built it like that. By sunset the hole had been filled, fresh soil spread across the surface, and grass seeds scattered over the area. If you didn't know what had happened, you would have never guessed a giant support post had been sitting there a few hours earlier. For the first time in over a month, there was nothing hanging over my backyard. Just open sky. A few weeks later, construction resumed. This time, a redesigned balcony appeared, smaller, fully inside their property line, and angled away from my house. Whoever drew the new plans made absolutely sure there would be no second dispute. I saw Ethan standing on it once after it was finished. He noticed me in the yard, looked away immediately, and went back inside. We never had another real conversation after that. Not because we hated each other. Because some relationships don't survive certain lessons. The funny thing is, if he had knocked on my door before building anything, things might have gone differently. Maybe we would have talked. Maybe we would have worked something out. Maybe not. But once someone decides they can take something that isn't theirs and asks for permission afterward, the conversation changes. These days my backyard feels the way it did when I first bought the house. Quiet, private, peaceful. On summer evenings I still sit beneath that old oak tree and watch the sunlight move across the grass. Sometimes I'll glance toward the Walker house and see the smaller balcony sitting exactly where it's supposed to be. And every single time, I think about how expensive arrogance can become. Now here's what I want to know from you. If you came home and discovered your neighbor had built part of their house over your property while you were gone, what would you have done? Would you have tried to settle it privately? Would you have ignored it to keep the peace? Or would you have called the city the moment you saw it? Let me know down in the comments because I've heard strong arguments from both sides. And if you enjoy stories about property disputes, difficult neighbors, and the moments when people discover that rules actually do apply to them, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who'd have an opinion about it. Trust me, after what happened here, I've got plenty more stories to tell.